June 15th, 1946. The war had been over for nearly a year, but for Captain Michael Harrison, the wounds remained as fresh as the day they were inflicted. He stood in the doorway of his modest colonial home in rural Pennsylvania, watching his two young children play in the yard without their mother. Eleanor, his wife of 7 years, had been taken from him by pneumonia in the harsh winter of 1944, leaving him with responsibilities he'd never been trained to handle and a heart fractured beyond what any field surgeon could repair. His daughter Sarah was 5 years old, with her mother's auburn hair and serious gray eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young child. His son Thomas, only 3, still called for his mother in the mornings, asking questions Michael couldn't answer with anything but tears and silence. Michael himself was only 32 years old, but the war had aged him considerably. Shrapnel, still embedded in his left shoulder, ached on cold mornings. The nightmares came regularly, moments when he'd wake up screaming, his hands reaching for weapons that weren't there, his mind reliving moments when boys not much older than 18 had bled out beneath his command in the muddy fields of France and Germany. He'd been discharged in March with a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, along with a diagnosis of what the Army called shell shock, though nobody quite knew what to do about it, except prescribe him sleeping pills and tell him to try to resume normal life. There was nothing normal about his life anymore. His farm, managed by hired hands while he was away, needed constant attention. His children needed constant care. And his heart, that traitorous organ that had continued beating when so many others had stopped, needed something he couldn't seem to find in the small town of Mercer, Pennsylvania, where everyone knew his story and pitted him in equal measure. The letter from the Department of War had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. It informed him that he was eligible for domestic assistance through a new program designed to help returning servicemen with young children. The government, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, had decided that German prisoners of war being held in camps throughout the United States could be assigned to work details in civilian homes under supervision to help with childcare and household maintenance. It seemed an odd solution to Michael at first, almost obscene in a way he couldn't quite articulate, employing the enemy to care for his own children while he struggled with grief and trauma. But his neighbor, Frank Morrison, had mentioned that 3 farms over, a German POW had transformed the household, cooking meals, managing children, generally making life livable again. And Michael was drowning. His own mother, elderly and frail, had tried to help for a time, but she lived in Pittsburgh and had her own health concerns. His sister was in New York with 4 children of her own. He had no wife, no family nearby, and the looks of sympathy from other women in town had slowly transformed into something else when they realized he had no intention of remarrying within the appropriate mourning period. Some called him a fool for his loyalty to Eleanor's memory. Others whispered about his mental state, his nightmares, his occasional vacant stares in the middle of conversations. So when the official letter arrived asking if he would like to host a German POW worker, Michael had filled out the application without thinking too deeply about what it might mean. The prisoner arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in early April, transported by an army truck driven by a tired-looking corporal who seemed eager to be anywhere else. Her name was Margarethe Hoffman, age 26, and when Michael first saw her step down from the truck in a modified uniform, he thought there must be some mistake. She was thin, almost translucent, with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun and blue eyes that held a weariness that seemed entirely disproportionate to her age. She'd been a nursemaid in Berlin before the war, she explained in carefully accented English, and then a nurse in field hospitals after conscription. She'd been captured when the Allies pushed through Germany, and after nearly a year in a POW camp, she'd been deemed a low-security risk suitable for civilian work placement. The camp commandant had sent her specifically because her file noted extensive childcare experience, which had impressed the relevant officers. Michael stood awkwardly in his kitchen while the corporal explained the terms of the arrangement. She would work 6 days a week from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. She would be compensated with room and board, lodged in the converted servants' quarters above the barn. She would be under constant supervision and responsibility, for her conduct fell entirely to Michael. Any infraction, any indication of disloyalty or escape attempt, would result in immediate return to the camp and legal consequences for Michael as the responsible party. The corporal emphasized this point several times, watching Michael carefully to see if he understood the gravity of the situation. Michael understood. He also understood that he was about to bring into his home a representative of a nation that had killed so many of his friends, that had forced his own hand in the killing of others, that had shaped the trauma that woke him up screaming most nights. Margarethe stood silently throughout this exchange, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression blank and unrevealing. After the corporal left, after the paperwork was signed and filed away, Michael showed her to her quarters. She walked behind him without speaking, her footsteps so quiet he could barely hear them on the wooden stairs. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a small mirror, and a window that looked out over the fields. It wasn't prison exactly, but it wasn't freedom either. Michael stood in the doorway, suddenly aware of how strange this all was, how inappropriate it might appear, how complicated it could become. I'll expect you to start tomorrow morning. The children eat breakfast at 7. We keep a schedule. Sarah attends school from 9 to 2:30, and Thomas is usually napping from 1 to 3. There's quite a bit of laundry. The cooking doesn't have to be elaborate. Simple meals are fine. My wife, Eleanor, she kept notes. There's a book in the kitchen drawer. He was speaking too quickly, filling the silence with information she probably didn't need and definitely didn't care about. Margarethe simply nodded, acknowledging his instructions with the obedience of someone trained to take orders. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock, she said in her careful English. Breakfast for the children. I will be ready, sir. Captain Harrison. You can call me Captain Harrison. Actually, Michael. Please, just Michael. He left her there and went downstairs, suddenly unsure why he'd asked her to use his first name, unsure about any of this arrangement. That night, he poured himself a whiskey and sat in Eleanor's empty chair while the house creaked around him with the sounds of age and loneliness. The first morning with Margarethe arrived before he was ready. He woke at 6:30, already dreading the day, the awkwardness of having a stranger in his home, a German stranger, someone connected to the nation that had taken so much from him. He dressed carefully and went downstairs to find her already in his kitchen, moving with efficient precision. She'd rolled her sleeves up and was preparing eggs, bacon, and toast with a calm competence that immediately eased something tight in his chest. She'd found Eleanor's recipe book. The coffee was hot and strong, just how he liked it. Sarah wandered down in her nightgown, her hair disheveled from sleep, and stopped short when she saw Margarethe. This is Greta, Michael said quickly. She's going to help us with cooking and cleaning and taking care of you and Thomas while I'm working in the fields. She was a nurse, like Mama was trained to be. Greta moved towards Sarah slowly, not crowding her, giving her space. Hello, small one. I'm very happy to meet you. Would you like help with your breakfast? Sarah looked at Michael, seeking permission or reassurance, or maybe just confirmation that this strange woman in their kitchen was acceptable. When he nodded, Sarah moved toward the table and let Margarethe help her into a chair. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but watching his daughter's tentative acceptance of this woman who was not her mother, Michael felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't warmth exactly, but perhaps the absence of cold. Thomas proved less reserved. When he bounded down the stairs in his pajamas, he found Margarethe flipping pancakes and immediately decided she was the most interesting person he'd ever encountered. He climbed into a chair and demanded pancakes in the imperious way of small children, and Margarethe responded without any sign of irritation. She simply nodded and produced a plate with a pancake shaped like a bunny rabbit, complete with blueberry eyes. Thomas laughed, a sound Michael hadn't heard in months, genuine and unself-conscious and wonderful. He watched Margarethe move around his kitchen with Eleanor's movements but not Eleanor's presence. She was different, this woman who'd come from the other side of a terrible war. She was efficient where Eleanor had been intuitive, quiet where Eleanor had been warm, measured where Eleanor had been spontaneous. Yet somehow, improbably, she seemed to fit into the rhythms of his household as though she'd been designed for it. Over the following weeks, Michael began to notice things. He noticed how Margarethe never complained, even though her room above the barn was small and cold and couldn't have been comfortable. He noticed how she learned the children's preferences and anticipated their needs without being asked. He noticed how she taught Sarah to count in both English and German, how she sang quietly while doing laundry, how she mended Michael's worn shirts with neat, careful stitches. He also noticed how she sometimes stood at the farm's edge in the evenings, staring out toward nothing, her expression haunted by something he recognized because he saw it every time he looked in a mirror. It was the particular sorrow of someone who'd lost everything in a war that hadn't been of their making. One evening in late April, unable to sleep and bothered by whiskey and nightmares, Michael found himself in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. Margarethe was there, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, staring out the dark window. He thought about going back to bed, but instead he found himself sitting down across from her. "Can't sleep?" Her voice was soft. "The nightmares. They come on days when the work was difficult. Sometimes the memories won't let me rest." Michael wasn't entirely sure why he was telling this German woman about his nightmares, but something about the darkness and the quiet made confession feel possible. "I understand," Margarethe said carefully. "I also have the nightmares. I treated many wounded soldiers in the hospitals. I remember their faces. I remember the ones who died despite everything I could do. I remember the choices I had to make with insufficient supplies, too many patients, and impossible circumstances." She paused, sipping her tea. "War teaches you to see things that you cannot unsee." "Yes," Michael agreed. "That's exactly what it does." They sat in companionable silence for a while, two people from opposite sides of a terrible conflict, finding solidarity in their shared trauma. Eventually, Michael went back to bed, but something had shifted in the way he perceived Margarethe. She was no longer simply a German POW, a stranger assigned to his home. She was a person who'd suffered, who'd lost things, who carried her own weight of sorrow. Over the summer, as the weather warmed and the farm demanded increasing attention, Michael found himself relying on Margarethe more and more. She managed the household with an efficiency that freed him to focus on the crops, the animals, the endless work of maintaining a functional farm. More importantly, she seemed to genuinely care for his children. Sarah, who'd been withdrawn since her mother's death, began to smile again. Thomas thrived under Margarethe's patient care. Michael would return from the fields in the evening, exhausted and aching, to find his children clean, fed, and happy. He'd find dinner prepared, his shirts mended, his house in order. It was the kind of domestic peace he'd thought was permanently lost. His neighbor Frank began making pointed comments. "Seems like you found yourself an excellent worker," Frank said one afternoon while they were working on fence repairs. "The German girl, I mean, she's good with the children. Better than good. Almost like she loves them or something." Michael had felt his face flush at this suggestion, though he wasn't entirely sure why. He does her job well. That's all that matters. But Frank just grinned with the knowing expression of someone who understood more about human nature than Michael wanted to acknowledge. By August, Michael had stopped thinking of Margarethe primarily as a German prisoner or a hired servant. He thought of her as Margaret, and he realized he'd been shortening her name in his mind, making her somehow less foreign, more integrated into his daily life. He noticed when she was tired, and he'd insist she take a break. He started leaving money on the kitchen table for her to purchase things she might need. He brought back fabric from town so she could make herself new clothes, because the modified prison uniforms she'd arrived in were worn and inadequate. One evening, as August turned towards September, Michael sat on the porch while Margaret put the children to bed. He could hear her singing a German lullaby to Thomas, her voice soft and melodic. Sarah had fallen asleep already, exhausted from a day of helping Margaret in the garden. "These children," Margaret said when she came back outside to sit beside him on the porch steps, "they remind me of my nieces. I had a brother in Berlin. He had 2 daughters, very close in age to your Sarah and Thomas. What happened to them?" Michael asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The Russians came to Berlin in April of this year. My brother and his family, they were still there. I don't know what happened to them. I have written letters to the Red Cross, trying to find them. Nothing has come back yet." Margaret's voice was steady, but Michael could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the porch railing. Sometimes he said slowly, not knowing quite how to say what he needed to say. Sometimes the not knowing is worse than the knowing. "I'm sorry. That's an inadequate thing to say, but I am sorry." She looked at him, and in her blue eyes, he saw the same profound sorrow he carried, the same weight of loss and uncertainty. "Thank you, Michael. That is kind." He almost didn't say it. The words seemed dangerous, like they might change everything if spoken aloud. But the silence was heavy between them, and he found himself unable to contain the thought any longer. "I don't know how to do this. My life, the children, moving forward. Eleanor died, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. I thought I'd never feel anything again except pain and regret. But these last months, having you here, having someone who understands what it means to carry trauma and loss, it's helped. And now I'm feeling things for you that I probably shouldn't be feeling." Margaret turned away, looking out toward the darkened fields. Michael immediately regretted speaking. He'd crossed the line. He'd created an awkward situation that would make her position untenable. She'd report him to the camp commandant. Or worse, she'd leave, and the house would collapse back into the lonely chaos of before. "That's not appropriate," Margaret said quietly. "I'm a German prisoner of war in your home. You're my employer. The gulf between us, it's too wide. It cannot be bridged." "I know that," Michael said. "I know it's inappropriate and impossible and complicated. I know all of that. But I needed you to know that I'm grateful. That whatever this is, whatever we've become to each other these past months, it matters to me. It's helped me survive." Margaret stood up, her face carefully composed. "I should check on the children. Make sure Thomas didn't kick off his blanket." She went inside, and Michael sat alone on the porch, unsure if he'd just ruined the best thing that had happened to him since Eleanor died, or if he'd simply spoken an inconvenient truth. The next weeks were complicated. Margaret remained professional, courteous, and entirely proper. She did her job with the same competence as always. But the easy companionship they developed seemed to have fractured. She no longer sat with him in the kitchen when she found him unable to sleep. She no longer sang while working. She took her meals alone in the barn quarters, rather than joining Michael and the children at the dinner table as she'd begun to do toward the end of August. Michael felt the loss acutely, not knowing how to repair what he'd damaged with his confession. He threw himself into work, exhausting himself physically in the hope that he might sleep without nightmares or dangerous feelings. By mid-September, as the seasons began to turn and the first hints of autumn crisped the air, Michael's mother came to visit from Pittsburgh. She'd wanted to see the children and check on her son, whom she'd worried about constantly since Eleanor's death. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Michael's mother arrived, and the older woman took in the scene with the sharp, analytical gaze of a woman who'd raised 3 children and understood domestic arrangements. "This must be the German girl," she said, not bothering with preamble. "The one Frank mentioned." Margaret dipped her head respectfully. "Yes, Mrs. Harrison. I'm Margarethe. I'm pleased to meet you." Michael's mother studied her with an intensity that made Margaret shift her weight nervously. "Michael," a word in the study, his mother said. Michael followed her into the room where his father had died 16 years earlier, a space that still held the weight of familial authority even in his absence. "Don't be foolish," his mother said without preamble. "That girl is clearly in love with your children. She's probably half in love with you as well, though she's got more sense than to show it. And you look alive for the first time since Eleanor died. Since you came home from the war, actually. I'm not foolish, Mother. She's a German prisoner. The circumstances are impossible. The circumstances are what we make them," his mother said sharply. "The war is over, Michael. Has been for over a year now. We're not still enemy nations. We're people trying to rebuild lives destroyed by terrible choices made by terrible people. That girl lost her family in a war that wasn't of her making, just like you lost friends in a war that wasn't of your making. Maybe instead of both of you being destroyed by it, you could help each other be something other than destroyed. You're speaking about marriage, about bringing a German into this community, into this family. The scandal alone would be devastating. People would talk. It would be difficult for the children." Michael's mother sat down in his father's chair, and Michael saw her age suddenly, the the weight of 90 years of living settling on her small frame. People always talk, Michael. That's never a good enough reason to deny yourself happiness. And the children love her already. They've been talking about her constantly since I arrived. She's taught them German songs and how to make pretzels. Sarah showed me a dress that Margaret made for her from scraps of fabric. Thomas brought me a wooden toy that Margaret apparently carved in the evenings. These aren't the actions of an employee performing a job. These are the actions of someone who loves them. Michael's chest tightened at this assessment, which he knew was accurate. There's the matter of her status. She's a prisoner. Surely there are regulations that can be addressed. Speak to the camp commandant. Speak to the relevant authorities. If you're serious about this, if you're willing to face the gossip and the judgment, then fight for it. But don't use regulations as an excuse to deny both yourself and her the possibility of happiness. That's just cowardice dressed up as propriety. Over dinner that evening, Michael's mother charmed Margaret with the ease of a woman who'd spent decades navigating social situations. She asked about Margaret's life before the war, her family, her education. She learned that Margaret had been studying to become a full nurse before the conscription, that she'd wanted to work for the Red Cross after the war, that she spoke 4 languages and had dreams of traveling beyond Europe. She treated Margaret not as a servant or a prisoner, but as a young woman with a full internal life. Watching his mother's kindness, watching Margaret's surprise and gradual relaxation, Michael felt his determination harden. He would fight for this, whatever it took. That night, after his mother had gone to bed in the guest room and the children were asleep, Michael went to find Margaret in the barn quarters. He climbed the narrow stairs quietly and knocked on her door. She opened it cautiously, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Michael, this is inappropriate. You shouldn't be here." "I know," he said. "I don't care anymore." "Margaret, I'm going to ask the camp commandant about your release from prisoner status. I'm going to find out what's necessary to make you a free person in this country rather than a POW. And I'm going to ask you to stay, not as an employee, but as part of this family. As my wife, if you'll have me." Margaret's hand moved to cover her mouth. "You can't ask me that. I cannot accept the circumstances, the scandal, the judgment from your community. I won't be the cause of your suffering. You're not the cause. The war is the cause. Loss is the cause. Grief is the cause. But standing here with you, knowing you, loving you despite everything logical that says I shouldn't, that feels like the opposite of suffering. That feels like survival. That feels like hope." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I have nothing, Michael. My family is likely dead. My country is occupied and destroyed. I'm a prisoner of war with no prospects and no future. How can I accept this? Because your country being destroyed doesn't destroy you. Because having nothing means you have everything to gain. Because I'm offering you a future here with me and with Sarah and Thomas. Because we can build something new together." Margaret reached out slowly and placed her hand against his cheek, her touch gentle and tentative. "If you do this," she said softly, "if you truly do this, I will spend the rest of my life honoring that choice. I will love your children as my own. I will be a faithful partner. I will not waste the gift of this second chance that you're offering me. Then say yes, Margaret. Say yes to me." Margaret's hand remained against Michael's cheek for a long moment, and in that silence, countless unspoken promises seemed to pass between them. When she finally withdrew her hand and stepped back in her small room, Michael wasn't entirely sure what her hesitation meant. Was it acceptance? Was it the moment before she closed the door on this possibility forever? He stood in the darkened corridor of the barn, his heart hammering in his chest, waiting for her to speak again. "I need to think," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is not a simple decision. I cannot simply say yes because my heart wants to say yes. There are realities that must be faced. Regulations, legal complications, the opinions of people who matter to your life." "I understand," Michael said, though the disappointment was sharp and immediate. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight, but I'm asking that you believe me when I say I'm serious about this. I will handle the regulations. I will face whatever complications arise. As for opinions, I've learned in the past years that other people's comfort is not my responsibility. My responsibility is to my children and to the person I love. Think about it, Margaret. Please." He left her there and made his way back to the main house, where his mother was waiting in the kitchen with 2 cups of hot milk she'd prepared. Did she say yes? His mother asked without preamble. Not yet. She's thinking about it. Good, his mother said. Anyone worth marrying wouldn't say yes immediately to a proposal made in a barn in the middle of the night. She's being sensible. That's the kind of woman you need. Michael spent the next morning in a state of barely contained anxiety, trying to work while his mind spun with possibilities and complications. Margaret was distant but not cold, professional but not unkind. She went through the motions of her work with competence, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she occasionally paused to stare out windows as though wrestling with invisible forces. That afternoon, before his mother left to return to Pittsburgh, she pulled Michael aside once more. "Whatever you decide to do about this situation, do it with your whole heart or don't do it at all. Half measures will destroy both of you. Margaret deserves someone fully committed to her happiness, and you deserve to stop living in the shadows of grief and trauma. The war took enough from both of you. Don't let guilt or fear take anything more." Michael drove his mother to the train station, and as he watched her depart, he felt the familiar weight of family responsibility settle on his shoulders. But this time it was different. He wasn't just responsible for his children anymore. He was responsible for their future, and that future seemed inextricably linked to the young German woman waiting for him back at the farm. The next morning, Michael dressed carefully and drove to the camp that held German prisoners of war about 30 miles from his home. The facility was a sprawling complex of barracks surrounded by fencing, with guard towers positioned at regular intervals. He was directed to the administrative offices, where a Major Patterson received him in a sparse, military office that smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. "Captain Harrison," the major said, shaking his hand. "I understand you're here regarding one of our work assignment prisoners, Margaret Hoffman." "That's correct, sir. I'd like to discuss the possibility of her formal release and the process for immigrating her to permanent status in the United States." Major Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Michael with the assessing gaze of a career military man. "This is about marriage, I presume." "It's about my personal request, sir. Margaret has been employed in my home for 5 months. She's an exceptional person, and I believe we could build a good life together. My children have already formed an attachment to her. I want to make that permanent and legal." The major picked up a file from his desk, presumably Margaret's prisoner record. "She's been classified as a low-security risk since her arrival. No disciplinary issues. Excellent work performance. No indication of disloyalty or escape attempts. She was a field nurse during the war, conscripted into service, not a member of any party organizations. Honestly, Captain, from what I'm looking at here, she's probably someone who would have left Germany the moment she could have if circumstances had allowed it. There are married couples doing this. German women and American soldiers. It's happening throughout the country. The Army's not exactly preventing it, though we're not exactly encouraging it either. There will be paperwork. Lots of paperwork. She'll need to renounce her German citizenship, technically. Though with Germany divided and occupied right now, that's complicated. She'll need an immigration certificate. She'll need to pass a loyalty review. She'll need medical clearance. It's going to take several months, maybe longer, but it can be done." Michael felt something tight in his chest ease slightly. "Thank you, sir. What happens next?" "I'll have my clerk start the paperwork. You'll need to complete a formal marriage petition. I'll need to interview Miss Hoffman again, formally, about her intentions and her background. And you should be aware, Captain, that when word gets out that you've married a German, some people aren't going to be happy about it." "I know, sir. I'm prepared to handle that." "Are you prepared for her to handle it? That's the real question." Major Patterson slid a folder across the desk to Michael. "These are the forms you'll need to complete. Bring them back when they're filled out, along with your birth certificate, discharge papers, and proof of your property ownership. We'll also need a statement from someone in your community regarding your character. Not another soldier. Someone civilian. A church official, a town leader, someone like that. Once we have all that, the wheels start turning." Michael spent the evening filling out the paperwork with Margaret. He'd told her what he'd accomplished at the camp, and though she'd expressed concern about the complications, she'd also expressed something that looked dangerously like hope. They sat at his kitchen table after the children were asleep, going through each form methodically. They wanted to know everything about Margarethe's background, her family history, her religious affiliation, her education, her work experience. Questions about her loyalty, her beliefs, her understanding of American democracy and values. Some of the questions seemed intrusive, almost insulting in their implications, but Margarethe answered everything with patience and precision. When they reached the final page, the one asking about her intentions and reasons for seeking American citizenship, Michael was the one who hesitated. "You should write the truth," Margarethe said quietly. "That you love me and want to build a life with me. That's what they're really asking." "I know what they're asking," Michael said. "I'm struggling with how to answer because the truth sounds impossible when written down. It sounds like infatuation or delusion or desperate post-war romance rather than something solid and real." "Write it anyway," Margarethe said. "The truth is often dismissed because we struggle to believe it about ourselves." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Write that you love me. Write that your children love me. Write that I make you feel alive again. Because all of that is true, Michael. I know it is. I feel it too." For the first time since that night in the barn, Margarethe spoke openly about her feelings, and Michael found himself nearly overwhelmed by the vulnerability of it. He filled out the remainder of the forms, his hand shaking slightly as he wrote about his love for this woman who'd entered his life through circumstances that should have made such love impossible. The character reference came from Reverend Mitchell at the Mercer Methodist Church. Michael had attended services sporadically since returning home, more out of a vague sense of duty than genuine faith. But the Reverend had known Eleanor, had spoken at her funeral, and had been one of the few people in the community to reach out to Michael during his darkest months of grief. When Michael approached him about providing a statement, the Reverend's response was surprisingly understanding. "Love is always unexpected, Captain Harrison," the Reverend had said. "Our faith teaches us to recognize grace wherever it appears. If you believe this young woman is an instrument of grace in your life and in the lives of your children, then you should pursue that with every ounce of courage you possess. I'll write you a statement that makes clear you're a man of good character and sound judgment." The paperwork was submitted to the camp in late September, and the waiting began. The process was slower than Michael had anticipated, bureaucratic wheels turning at their own grinding pace. October passed with no official word. Margarethe continued working as she had before, but now there was a different quality to their interactions. They spoke openly about the future, about what they wanted for Sarah and Thomas, about what their life might look like if all the paperwork was approved. Michael began exploring his options for expanding the farm, looking at properties adjacent to his own. He imagined a larger house, space for the family he and Margarethe might have together. Margarethe, meanwhile, began teaching the children more deliberately, as though she were preparing them for a future where she wasn't simply an employee but a permanent part of their lives. Sarah started calling her Greta instead of Margarethe, a German nickname that seemed to bridge the distance between the woman who worked in their house and the woman who might soon be her mother. Thomas, at 3 years old, had never known any significant female authority except his late mother and his grandmother. For him, Greta was simply the person he loved, the person who made his favorite foods and sang to him, and mended his clothes and held him when he was sick. On November 15th, Major Patterson called with news. The paperwork had been approved at the local level, and Margarethe's loyalty review had come back clear. She was to be formally released from prisoner of war status effective December 1st. She would still need to complete the immigration and naturalization process, which would take additional months, but she would no longer be classified as a prisoner. "I'll need you both to come to the camp on November 20th for the formal release ceremony," the major explained. "It's not mandatory, but I thought you'd want to be here when it happens. It's one less thing that ties her to that life." Michael's hands shook as he hung up the telephone. He went to find Margarethe in the garden, where she was gathering vegetables for the evening meal. "The news is good," he said without preamble. "You've been approved for release. December 1st. That means we can proceed with the marriage immediately after." Margarethe set down her basket, her face carefully composed, though Michael could see the emotion beneath the control. "This is real, then. It's actually happening." "Yes, it's happening," Michael said. "Unless you're having second thoughts." "Are you?" Margarethe smiled, and it was the kind of smile that seemed to illuminate her entire face, transforming her from the serious, controlled woman she usually was into someone younger and lighter. "I have had second thoughts for weeks, Michael. But each time I think about saying no, I imagine my life after you send me back to Germany. I imagine living without Sarah and Thomas. I imagine living without you. And no second thoughts can survive that imagination. I don't want to go back. I want to stay here. I want to be part of this family. I want to build a life with you." Michael pulled her into his arms, and for the first time, he allowed himself to fully believe that this impossible situation might actually become his reality. On November 20th, Michael, Margaret, Sarah, and Thomas went to the camp for the official release ceremony. It was a brief, formal affair conducted by Major Patterson in his office. Margaret signed documents renouncing her status as a prisoner of war, and in exchange, she was given a certificate of release and a civilian identification document that classified her as a German national in transition to American resident status. Sarah and Thomas didn't fully understand what was happening, but they understood that something significant was occurring. Thomas hugged Margaret's legs after the paperwork was completed, unwilling to let her out of his sight. The major shook Margaret's hand and then Michael's, offering a quiet nod of approval that seemed to acknowledge both the paperwork and the genuine nature of the union being formed. "As you drive away from this facility," the major said to Michael, "you're leaving behind an era. You're not bringing a prisoner home. You're bringing a free woman. I trust you'll treat her accordingly." "I will, sir," Michael assured him. As they drove away from the camp in the late afternoon light, Margaret stared out the window with an expression of such profound emotion that Michael reached over and took her hand. "You're free," he said. "You're actually free." "Legally, yes," Margaret said. "But freedom is a strange thing, Michael. I have been free from confinement, but I have not been free from the weight of loss and fear. Now, driving away from that place with you and Sarah and Thomas, I feel what true freedom might be. I feel like I can breathe for the first time since the war began." They stopped in town on the way home, at the courthouse, where Michael had already made arrangements. The judge, a friend of his father's, was willing to oversee a marriage without the traditional waiting period given the unusual circumstances and the fact that they'd essentially been living together in a committed arrangement already. They were married on November 22nd in a small ceremony in the judge's office. Margaret wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric that Michael's sister had sent from New York. It was a simple cream-colored dress with subtle embroidery at the cuffs and collar, elegant without being ostentatious. Michael wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to bury Eleanor 4 years earlier. The judge smiled gently when he noticed this, understanding that this ceremony was not replacing Eleanor's memory, but rather honoring it by moving forward. Sarah and Thomas were there, as witnesses in the way that children could be. Sarah didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood that Greta was now something more than before. Thomas simply understood that his favorite person in the world was now wearing a white dress, which seemed significant and wonderful in the way that all things Greta did seemed significant and wonderful to him. After the brief ceremony, they returned to the farmhouse, where Michael had arranged a small celebration. His sister had sent money for food, and Reverend Mitchell's wife had prepared a cake. A few neighbors came by with gifts and well wishes, though Michael could sense the complicated reactions beneath the congratulations. There were smiles that didn't quite reach eyes. There were comments about his courage and Margaret's fortune that contained subtle undertones of judgment. But there were also genuine warm wishes from people like Frank Morrison and his wife. People who understood that love and loss and survival often create bonds that transcend the conventional boundaries of nationality and race and wartime allegiances. That night, for the first time, Margaret came upstairs from the barn quarters to sleep in the master bedroom, the bedroom that had been empty since Eleanor's death. Michael had asked if she wanted to change the room, to make it feel less like a shrine to his deceased wife, but Margaret had declined. Eleanor was part of this family's story, she'd said. Her memory deserves to remain in this space. I'm not trying to replace her. I'm trying to build something new alongside what was. So they slept in the bed where Eleanor had given birth to Sarah, where she'd nursed Thomas, where she'd lain dying of pneumonia, while Michael held her hand and whispered promises he couldn't keep. Margaret didn't feel like an interloper in that bed. She felt like someone continuing a story that had been interrupted, making sense of a narrative that seemed to demand her presence. In the days following the marriage, life shifted into a new configuration. Margaret was no longer an employee but a wife and a mother. Legally, she wasn't yet a citizen, but she was a resident alien with a path to naturalization. Socially, She was a curiosity and a scandal, the woman who'd married an American soldier after being a German prisoner of war. The local newspapers picked up the story, which brought attention both sympathetic and hostile. Some people came to gawk, wanting to see the German woman who'd managed to captivate a war hero. Others stayed away, unwilling to associate with a family that had bridged the gulf between nations still technically at odds in many ways. Margaret bore it all with a composure that impressed and sometimes frustrated Michael. "Why do you not seem bothered by the judgment?" he asked one evening as they prepared for bed. "Because I have faced much worse judgment," Margaret replied. "I survived the war. I survived capture and imprisonment. I survived the loss of my family, my country, my entire world. People looking at me with suspicion or dislike. This is nothing. This is background noise compared to what I have endured. And more importantly, Michael, I have something now that I didn't have for years. I have hope. I have love. I have children who call me mother. I have a husband who looks at me like I'm the most precious thing in his world. Nothing else matters compared to that." The months following their marriage were intense and complicated. Margaret attended naturalization interviews, submitted medical tests, filled out endless paperwork. She began the process of learning about American history and civics, preparing for the citizenship exam she would eventually need to pass. She planted a garden in the spring, growing vegetables familiar to her, but adapting to the seasons and soil of Pennsylvania. She attended church with Michael and the children, sitting in the pew that had held Eleanor for so many years, gradually becoming accepted as the new Mrs. Harrison rather than the German woman who'd replaced Eleanor. Sarah, now in school, began telling her classmates about her new mother without the emotional complications that might have burdened her if Margaret had attempted to replace Eleanor too quickly. Teachers noted that Sarah seemed happier, more integrated, less haunted by the loss that had marked her for so long. Thomas, who had few memories of Eleanor, accepted Margaret as his mother without complication or guilt. By the autumn following the marriage, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Michael one morning while they were having coffee before the children woke, and she watched his face transform with an emotion so complex and profound that she found herself crying. "This baby," Margaret said gently, touching the still flat plane of her belly, "this baby means that we are truly building something new. This child will be half German and half American, and will never know division or hatred the way we have known it. This child will be proof that what we've built is real and lasting." Michael reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "I never thought I'd feel this again," he said. "I thought Eleanor's death had ended my life in the ways that mattered. I thought I would spend the rest of my years simply managing my grief and raising my children as best I could. But you came into my life and somehow, improbably, you transformed everything. I don't have words adequate to express my gratitude." "You don't need words," Margaret said. "You're expressing your gratitude every day by choosing to love me, by choosing to believe in what we could build together. That's enough." The pregnancy was smooth and uncomplicated, and by the time Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth in May of 1947, she was already a permanent resident with the majority of her citizenship requirements completed. Elizabeth was beautiful and healthy, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes and her own distinct personality that seemed to combine both parents' best qualities. She cried when hungry, slept when tired, seemed endlessly fascinated by the world in the way all newborns are. What struck Michael most profoundly was watching Margaret hold Elizabeth, seeing the way she held the baby with a tenderness that spoke of healing. He understood that for Margaret, this child represented more than just the future they were building together. This child was proof that love had survived the war, that creation could follow destruction, that German and American, enemy and ally, could become one. In the spring of 1948, Sarah brought home her report card from school, and Michael and Margaret studied it together at the kitchen table. Excellent grades across all subjects, including a note from her teacher indicating that Sarah had become one of the most helpful students in the classroom, often assisting other children and showing leadership qualities. "She's thriving," Margaret observed. "Your Eleanor would be proud." Michael took Margaret's hand, a gesture that had become familiar and beloved over the past years. "Eleanor is proud. I believe that actually. I believe that wherever she is, whatever happens after this life, she knows that her children are loved and cared for and growing up in a household built on genuine affection and commitment." There's no way her memory could be honored better than that. As Margaret's citizenship date approached, Michael made sure they attended a celebration at the courthouse where several new citizens were being sworn in. Margarethe stood with her hand on her heart, speaking the oath of allegiance with a clarity and conviction that seemed to resonate through the room. When she turned to Michael afterward, there were tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I am American now," she said. "Legally, officially, I am American. I am home." They walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine, and Michael pulled Margarethe close to him. "You've been home since you arrived at my farm," he said. "I realized that a long time ago. I'm just glad you finally realized it too." The years that followed were marked by the ordinary joys and complications of family life. Sarah grew up and attended high school, where she made friends and developed passions and began to understand her place in the world as a young woman. Thomas became a thoughtful, sensitive boy who loved helping on the farm and who seemed to embody the best of both his parents and his stepmother. Elizabeth grew from a newborn into a bright toddler, then a curious child who asked endless questions and seemed to absorb knowledge like a sponge. Michael and Margarethe had 2 more children, a son named Charles and another daughter named Emma. The farmhouse, which had felt so empty and haunted in the years after Eleanor's death and throughout Michael's darkness and trauma, became filled with the sounds of children playing, Margaret's voice singing German lullabies mixed with American folk songs, Michael's laughter at dinner as they recounted the events of the day. In 1950, on a spring morning not unlike the morning when Margarethe had first arrived at the farm, Michael and Margarethe stood together on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was helping Emma with a jump rope. Thomas and Charles were attempting to fly a kite that kept falling out of the sky. Elizabeth was chasing butterflies through the garden. "Life," Michael said quietly, reflecting on how far they'd come. "I never thought I'd have this again. I thought the war had taken my capacity for happiness. I thought grief was all that remained. But you came, and you changed everything." Margarethe leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "We changed each other," she said. "You gave me a home when I had nothing. You gave me children to love. You gave me a reason to believe that a better future was possible. But I like to think that I gave you something too. I gave you permission to live again. I gave you proof that love doesn't recognize borders or nations or old enmities. That German and American could be not just coexist, but genuinely become one family. I gave you that, and you gave it to me as well." By 1955, nearly a decade after Margarethe first arrived at Michael's farm, the war felt like ancient history to the children. Sarah, now a teenager, didn't remember Eleanor at all and seemed to view Margarethe simply as her mother, the only mother she truly knew with any real clarity of memory. Thomas remembered Eleanor only as a vague presence from early childhood, a kind of half-remembered dream. Elizabeth, Charles, and Emma knew Eleanor only through stories and photographs, understanding her as part of their family history, but not in any way that competed with their relationship with Margarethe. Michael and Margarethe had built something that transcended the circumstances of its beginning. The scandal that had greeted their marriage had largely faded as the decade moved forward. The world was changing. The Cold War was becoming the defining struggle, and the alliances that had seemed so clear during the actual war were becoming more complicated. People had enough to worry about without judging their neighbors for the decisions made in the immediate aftermath of war. On a cool autumn evening in 1955, Michael and Margarethe sat on the porch of their farmhouse, much as they had done countless times over the years. Their children were inside, doing homework or preparing for bed. The farm stretched out before them in the gathering darkness, the fields they'd worked, the land they'd stewarded, the place where they'd built their life together. "Do you ever regret staying?" Michael asked. "Do you ever wish you'd insisted on going back to Germany, trying to locate your family, building a life there instead?" Margarethe took his hand, a gesture that still thrilled him even after nearly a decade of marriage. "Every day, I don't regret my choice. Every day I wake up and see you, and our children, and this life we've built, and I am grateful. Germany is my homeland by birth, but America is my home by choice. I left behind one family when the war took them, but I found another family here. I was a stranger when I arrived, but I became a wife, a mother, a partner. You gave me that second chance, Michael. You chose to love someone you should have had every reason to hate. That choice has defined my entire life since. Would you go back? Would you return to Germany if you had the chance?" Michael asked carefully. If there was a way to find your family, to reconnect with them, would you leave me and the children to do that? Margaret turned to face him, and in her eyes, he saw the depths of the emotion she carried, the weight of loss and gratitude intertwined. If my family were alive and I could find them, I would want to see them. I would want to tell them about my life, about the children, about you. But I would not stay. I could never leave this. I could never leave you. Germany tried to destroy my soul, Michael. The war almost succeeded. But you and this family, you saved me. You gave me back to myself. That is not something I could ever walk away from, regardless of what I might find in the ashes of my homeland. Michael pulled her close, and they sat in the darkness listening to the sounds of the farm settling in for the night. Inside the house, one by one, lights came on in the children's rooms, and then gradually went out as bedtime approached. It was a simple life in many ways. Farm work, family obligations, the routines of rural Pennsylvania. But beneath the simplicity was something profound, something that spoke to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for love to transcend even the deepest divides. By 1960, as the second decade of their marriage began, Michael found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He'd returned from war a broken man, convinced that joy and love and genuine happiness had died in the mud of European battlefields. He'd been a widower at 28, a father to 2 small children, isolated in his grief and trauma. And then Margaret had arrived, not as a solution to his problems, but as a human being herself wounded by war, herself carrying loss and displacement and the weight of a destroyed world. Together, they'd healed each other not by pretending the war hadn't happened, not by forgetting their losses, but by choosing to honor those losses by living well, by building something good, by proving that love and hope were more powerful than hatred and despair. He thought of Eleanor often, with affection and gratitude for the years they'd had together, for the beautiful children she'd given him. But he no longer thought of her death as the end of his story. He thought of it as a chapter that had closed, opening a door to a new chapter he never could have anticipated but wouldn't trade for anything in the world. On a spring morning in 1960, 15 years after Margaret first arrived at his farm, Michael stood in the yard watching his youngest children play. Elizabeth was now a teenager herself. Sarah had graduated high school and was attending college to study nursing, following in Margaret's footsteps. Thomas was working on the farm with Michael, learning the business of agriculture with a seriousness that suggested he might make it his life's work. Charles and Emma were still in their school years, growing up in a household that now felt completely normal to them. A household where German and English were spoken interchangeably, where traditions from both cultures were celebrated, where love was the governing principle. Margaret came out to stand beside him, and Michael wrapped an arm around her waist. "I was thinking about the day you arrived," he said. "How scared I was. How uncertain about everything. I remember thinking that bringing a German prisoner into my home was the worst possible decision I could make. How wrong I was." Margaret smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was scared too, Michael. I didn't know what I was walking into. I thought perhaps you would mistreat me, or that your children would reject me, or that I would spend years isolated and alone in this American countryside. But you were kind to me from the beginning. You saw me as a person, not as a prisoner or an enemy. You gave me the gift of being seen, of being valued, of being loved. That's all any of us really wants, isn't it? To be seen and loved for who we truly are." Michael nodded slowly, understanding the profound truth of her words. "I think I was lost before you came," he said quietly. "I was going through the motions of living, but I wasn't actually alive. Your arrival forced me to feel again, to hope again, to believe that the future could hold something other than just managing grief. I don't know what I did to deserve a second chance at happiness, but I'm eternally grateful that I received it." They stood together in companionable silence, watching their family play and work and build their lives in the place that had become home to all of them. Above them, the Pennsylvania sky was clear and bright, full of possibility and promise. Behind them, the farmhouse stood solid and real, sheltering generations. And in that moment, with Margaret's hand in his and their children visible in various corners of the yard, Michael Harrison felt completely at peace. The war had taken so much from both of them, but it had also, in the most unexpected and miraculous way possible, brought them together. It had created the circumstances for their meeting, had broken them both down to their most essential selves, had stripped away pretense and artifice and social convention. In the aftermath of all that destruction, they had found each other and built something beautiful.